international news agency. And now I work for a nonprofit. I still report news and write and investigate. And I've written two books. A new one is coming out in March. And my books really look at agriculture, particularly pesticides and the damage that they do to the environment, as well as human health, and how companies like Monsanto have worked really hard to hide the dangers of these products and to control regulators and really deceive consumers for many decades.
Quite explosive. Coincidentally, though, one of our first guests was a diplomat as well as an agriculture expert. His name is Mr. Andile Hose. We were speaking exactly about food insecurity and how it's going to be Africa's next pandemic. Your work is quite connected to this. After so many years as a journalist, what still keeps you passionate about the field of investigating and writing about these explosive findings?
I just think that, in order for us to deal with these really important issues, food insecurity is very real. It's very critical in many parts of the world. And to really deal with these in a way that is going to benefit people over the long term, we have to have truthful information. We have to have honesty and transparency in developing public policy. And what we've seen in the United States and play out in many other countries around the world is a lack of transparency and a lack of truthfulness. And what this does is it provides perhaps short-term answers and short-term practices that benefit the corporations and may appear to benefit people in the short term, but over the long term really are very detrimental to small farmers, to consumers, and to all of us who, worry about the health of our children and the health of our future generations.
Definitely. And recently I watched again on Al Jazeera, because I'm a big fan of truthful journalism. I saw that parts of Southern Africa, particularly Madagascar, the situation is so dire to a point where people are mixing mud and some of the food they get from a contaminated river to eat or make means. And it's quite difficult because, again, Africa is some of the most arable land, but again, you're looking at pesticides and nobody ever tells us about the dangers contained therein. What has been some of the startling findings that you've had?
Oh my goodness. I mean, there are so many dangers associated with intense pesticide use, so many diseases, both acute and chronic long-term. I mean, cancer is one of them, of course, infertility and reproductive issues, birth defects, Parkinson's disease, neurological problems in children and developmental problems in children. All of these things are proven in science and shown to us. And yet these big corporations keep saying, it's worth the risk. You need to use these pesticides in order to feed the world. And what the United Nations has found, and people who have studied this around the world who are not associated with the big companies, is that food insecurity is most often not tied to a lack of pesticides or GMO seeds. It's an issue of political instability or a lack of distribution, a lack of infrastructure and transportation and refrigeration, a lack of maybe democratic practices in which people are able to start and own and maintain their own businesses, and a lack of sufficient capital for this business development. There are a lot of things that can and should be done to help small farmers and to help people in regions of the world in which we are suffering from food insecurity. But pesticides and GMOs are not the answer. For instance, in the United States, we use a lot of pesticides to grow a lot of corn every year. And we have an abundance. We have so much corn. We have over 1 billion bushels of corn every year that we can't do anything with, that the government considers to be an overstock. We can't feed it to enough livestock or enough people. We don't ship it overseas. It's just a waste. And yet the money that these big corporations bring in from selling the seed and selling the chemicals keeps them pushing policies that keep us growing more and more corn, even though we don't need it.
Scary. And do you feel that there's always a fine line between putting the health of an ordinary citizen as a priority, but at the same time generating massive profits for the profiteering companies that are always at the forefront of these anomalies or these controversies?
Yes, I mean, what we see in the internal documents from these companies, and this is how I've done a lot of my work, is I look at internal communications with our regulators and with the companies themselves and how they communicate to themselves and to other companies. They're not putting the health of consumers as a priority ever. It's the profits that they can make. And, this is something I think people need to understand. The Monsanto, for instance, will tell you that it's all about the farmer, and they're out there trying to help the farmer and give the farmer the tools that the farmer needs. That's not what they talk about internally. What they talk about internally is how they're going to maximize profits. And we've seen that a lot with Monsanto, for instance, when they were trying to produce a GMO wheat, and farmers said, we don't need a GMO wheat, we don't want a GMO wheat. And Monsanto kept saying, it doesn't really matter if you need it or want it, we want you to buy it. And that was a big push in the early 2000s. So, this is something the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation right now, is very active in Africa, pushing GMOs, pushing pesticides, really trying to shape public policy there. And people need to understand that even though they present themselves as a charitable organization to do good, they really are aligned in many respects with these big corporations. They have a former Monsanto executive running a lot of these things for many years. So there's a lot going on, I think, that people don't understand. And if they're educated about it, they can push back and they can help fight for policies that really do benefit individuals and small farmers.
I wonder, though, to what degree do you feel a bit of weather modification has played a part in creating these intentional famines? When you look at areas that have high prevalence of food insecurity, is there a linkage between the two?
There are different kinds of GMOs, cotton and soy and corn, particularly there in South Africa. And you see those primarily as herbicide tolerance, so increasing the use of glyphosate and other herbicides. You also see an insect resistance. But what we've learned is that intensive use of these chemicals on these GMOs really depletes the health of the soil. It affects the biodiversity, the microorganisms that are needed to have the plants be healthy and strong and to have your soil be healthy. So, it's sort of a vicious cycle, and you really need to be careful. There needs to be a balance, and there needs to be a respect for Mother Nature, I think, and the delicate interplay of our environmental resources. And you don't see that with these GMO intensive farming practices usually.
And when I shared with some of my colleagues, another investigative journalist, to say, I'm going to be interviewing Carey Gillam, and this is the topic we're going to be speaking about. And another issue that came was we're now under a strict lockdown in South Africa, where the challenge now is government procuring enough funds to buy vaccines. And people are saying, but you're now looking at vaccines from the same player who's been famed all over the world for engaging in corrupt and somewhat not so palatable practices. How then do we trust anything that comes from the same Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is linked to the medical sector? Again, we're looking at food insecurity as well as pesticides and all these other things. How trustworthy can these organizations be, especially looking at their history as well as the atrocities that they've created in the whole of the universe?
I know, right? That's a particularly compelling question right now and debate right now. It's hard to trust these companies that so often have deceived consumers and so often have put out products that harm people. So it's very difficult. But of course, the COVID-19 is very deadly, right, to a lot of people, and has really been a scourge across the world. So we do need a vaccine or some sort of help for people. But I wrestle with that as well. I'm not sure I want to take the vaccine. I'm not sure we have enough transparency about the risks and the development of the vaccine. Yet I want to protect, my family and my community. So I think those are really good questions. And we need our government and our leaders to be very transparent and to be really sharing data and information, and not to be mandating vaccines when we don't fully know the impacts of our health long term.
There seems to be a growing trend where people like yourself who are exposing these anomalies and corrupt practices from enclaves which some have come to name corporatocracies. There seems to be a trend where you are isolated, you are vilified, and almost anything and everything about you is destroyed completely. What have been some of the challenges that you faced as an investigative journalist?
Yeah, well, that's certainly true. they've done it to a lot of people. Monsanto did it to me. They put out a lot of effort into trying to discredit me and harass me and to smear my reputation and to ruin my career. We have internal documents that came out from litigation that demonstrate that show they hired a consulting company in Washington, D.C. and put out a plan to try to discredit my book and get negative book reviews out. And they've funded front groups that have written horrible articles about me and said I'm a Russian agent and all sorts of crazy things. But yeah, I mean, that's what they try to do, is they try to discredit people and isolate them in a way that silences them. And I guess from where I sit, it just made me ever more determined to not be silenced.
What do you make of collusive practices where state-sponsored lies in conjunction with private capital are colluding to essentially hold humanity at ransom?
That's exactly what's happening more and more. And I think that the more that we allow greed and capitalism and corporate power, the more that we allow this sort of consolidation. Right now, controlling our seeds and chemical products around the world, we really have 5 companies that dominate. I mean, that is far too few, and they are owning the seed companies and owning the germplasm and owning the chemicals and owning our regulators through financial contributions and lobbying. And I think this is we need a fundamental change in the way we view, particularly the way we grow and produce food. Food is essential to our health. It's essential to the health of our environment. And if we don't protect it and recognize that and protect it with quite a passion, we don't face a very healthy or happy future, and our children certainly don't.
I would like to revert back briefly to the challenges that I raised in terms of you being isolated as a journalist. I think most are scared to venture into the type of work that you do. If you look at the likes of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, if you look at Chelsea Manning, if you look at maybe, what's the third one that I want to mention? Edward Snowden even. Yeah, definitely. Do you feel that this trend is intentionally publicized into the different media platforms so that it scares you into a corner, so that you end up in a position where you're saying it's enough, they can continue with their corruption and greed, I'm not involved, I'm not interested?
Oh yeah, definitely. I've known a lot of people, and certainly my work doesn't rise to the level of an Edward Snowden or something. I mean, they've all done profoundly important work and exposed profoundly important information. But yes, I mean, that is very much intimidation and harassment. And I've run into a lot of people who have stepped aside and decided that it's better to stay quiet and to continue to gain any. I've lost income, I've lost opportunity, I've lost a lot in continuing to pursue this line of investigative work when Monsanto tried to shut me down. So it definitely sidelines a lot of investigative work, I think.
Share with us a bit about your book. I see the cover there, whitewash. I can't read the fine print. What was it? When was it published? And what's been the reviews about?
So my first book, Whitewash, came out a couple of years ago, and that was really an expose of how Monsanto had whitewashed or lied, deceived the world about the safety of its herbicides, its Roundup products and glyphosate. And I relied on a lot of, documents, freedom of information documents and scientific studies. And it was very well, I won 3 journalism awards for it, and was asked to testify to the European Parliament about my findings and the World Forum for Democracy. And Monsanto couldn't contradict or counter any of the information because when you go back to the 1970s and 80s and 90s and all throughout, there has been abundant evidence that this chemical is very harmful, not only to people, but to the environment. And that has been covered up for a very, very long time. And our regulators have allowed Monsanto to tell them how to regulate this chemical and how to view the science. And it's done a lot of harm to a lot of people. Here in the United States, we have over 100,000 people now with cancer who have sued, and our Bayer, who bought Monsanto, is now paying out about $11 billion in settlements to all these people who are suffering from cancer because of their exposure to Roundup.
You've almost answered my next question, which was, how innocent is Bayer Syngenta? Because I know they're also quite huge in the same business as Monsanto is. Are they also complicit in the same crimes or criminality?
Oh my goodness. Syngenta, in particular, Syngenta, has long pushed. They're owned by ChemChina now, but they have long pushed a chemical called paraquat, which is an herbicide. And there's litigation around paraquat. It causes Parkinson's disease. It's also quite toxic on an acute basis. It's been responsible for a lot of poisoning, farmer poisonings around the world. And, yes, there's growing litigation and information that Syngenta has long known that paraquat was quite deadly and could cause Parkinson's, and decided that they could make more money than they would have to pay out to people that they injured, and they kept selling it. And so that is all to come out shortly as well.
Mm-hmm. But are there alternatives though? Because I know there are some farmers who are probably listening to us and saying, but what else is out there for us to survive on? There are pests, yes, and there are certain ways and means that we as farmers are perhaps limited. And Monsanto does present a credible solution. Are there alternatives in your research that you found?
Yeah, well, definitely, yes. And I want to make clear, I don't ever want to tell farmers what to do or how to do it. I think that farming is the most important job out there, and farmers have a lot to figure out, obviously, to produce the most yield and the most productive crop. But I think that they do need to understand the dangers of these pesticides and to take proper risks and to really incorporate that into their mindset as they are determining what kind of practices they want to engage in. But certainly here in the United States, we have a growing number of farmers who are shunning all pesticide use and are going back to sort of the time-honored traditions of crop rotation and using cover crops and doing other things to more naturally enhance the nutritional, value of the soil, the microorganisms of the soil, and they are seeing really good results, almost, matching or beating the yields of these GMO pesticide-grown crops. So it's not as easy, perhaps, as just planting a GMO crop and spraying a pesticide, but they're finding over the long term, it's much healthier for people as well as the soil and all of the insect population and the other parts of our environment that are so crucial to our long-term sustainability.
Definitely. Do you feel that as a journalist, the world as we know it is held ransom by one individual or a foundation which has portrayed itself as a savior of humanity on the one end, but it's decimating us en masse?
Are we speaking of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation? I mean, yes, I think, again, there's a lot of risk and a lot of danger when we see, one very powerful foundation really dictating these practices to people and pushing these policies that are shown to be, we know these are so damaging to our environment. You read about the insect apocalypse. Certainly the news has been down there about the demise of our insect population around the world, startling demise in the insect population. And insects, while we might find them to be annoying, really are so essential to food production, and just again the interplay that is required for us to have healthy soils, healthy water, healthy plants. We're seeing the bird population in decline, particularly in North America. A lot of this is due to overuse of pesticides. We're hearing that from the United Nations. It's not in doubt. And when you see insect decline and you see bird decline and increasing, infertility, reproductive problems in men and women around the world, the red flag is waving, the warning flag is out there, and we need to be paying attention to it. And pesticides are a very big contributor to environmental harm, environmental contamination that is damaging our health over the long term.
And I'm sure there's another person sitting down there thinking, obviously we need to plant food for us to survive, get nutrition and all of that. You've got pesticides to run away from, you've got GMOs on the one hand, but if you look up to the skies, there's also chemtrails. Where do we run to? Because we don't all own spaceships.
None of us do we? I don't know that, and that is sort of the question, right? Is it too late? Is there still hope? Can we still make changes that are critical that can turn back, detrimental climate change. And some people say yes and some people say no. I'm certainly not an expert in that. I think we have to try as best we can. And certainly there are cities and places where that are so damaging now, where people, asthma and lung disease and problems are so prevalent, and it's just become accepted. And we have the same thing, in many towns in the United States. We have communities that live next to these big plants and facilities, and the cancer rates are off the charts. And it seems like our regulators and the powers that be are telling us to just accept it. And this is just part of a modern society. I guess I'm still trying to advocate for us not to accept it, and just to try to motivate people to be vocal and to demand change and better policies.
The curious truth seeker in me, not a conspiracy theorist, is wondering if there isn't a relationship between the cancer industry as well as people like Monsanto, Syngenta, and Bayer even, because the one is creating disease and the other is profiting from the disease that's been created.
Oh, right. Yes, you see so many people talk about that. And in fact, it was ironic or interesting that in an appellate court in California, that when Monsanto was appealing and an issue that was trying to restrict glyphosate, you saw one of the companies that came in to defend Monsanto and tried to file an intervening with the court was a pharmaceutical company that makes a cancer drug that treats non-Hodgkin lymphoma, which is exactly what Monsanto's Roundup has been found to cause.
Wow.
And this company came in and they have a brand new drug out to treat non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and they were defending Monsanto in court. So, yeah, it's all connected, I think.
Wow. Let's zoom into your book, The Monsanto Papers and Corporate Corruption. What is it about? When is it launching? Where will it be available?
Oh, yes, thank you. So this comes out in March, my second book. And again, it looks at Monsanto, but this really is more a human story. It follows the story of a man named Lee Johnson, who's just an average middle-class man, 2 children, working a job as a groundskeeper for a school district, and was spraying a lot of Roundup, Ranger Pro, Monsanto products, and developed this really horrible type of non-Hodgkin lymphoma that doctors, said would kill him. It was terminal. And so the story follows Lee and his family as they sort of learn about the dangers of Roundup and file a lawsuit and go to trial, and the lawyers who took his case. And it's just a very human story about the impacts of all of these other things that we've just talked about, how it affects real people and real families. And, it's a very sad story, I think, but one that is eye-opening, and it's gotten pretty good reviews. And so we'll see. Lee is actually still alive. He's beaten the odds. The doctors all thought he would not live past 2019, but he's still out there kicking. So
are we likely to see a movie in his honor?
I'm sorry?
Are we likely to see a movie in his honor, an adaptation of your book into a film?
Oh, there actually is, yeah, there are TV and movie scripts being written right now about that. So hopefully.
Great stuff. And in your own experience, and I'm sure you sit down and look to the past and look at the current times, and you look into the future at the same time, where do you feel the field of journalism is headed?
Oh my gosh, I really don't think it's good. I mean, right now, in a lot of ways, I think journalism is being weaponized, and I think a lot of the big news outlets, on the one hand, you have sort of multimedia that really shows very little in terms of journalistic principles, and they're just out there to exploit and to get clicks and get eyeballs, and they don't seem to care too much about facts and context. And that's, ginning up people on the right and the left, and I think really driving a lot of division among us. But then you even have established news organizations like the New York Times and the Associated Press and others who do seem to be, not as unbiased as I think they should be. We seem to have lost the idea that we should be an independent and unbiased arbiter and just tell the facts on both sides. But like the vaccine, most of the big news outlets don't want to talk about the risks that come with the vaccines, even though it's very real and it's factual and it's documented. They want to just push this narrative that's being pushed out that we should all accept and welcome and get our vaccines as soon as possible. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not so true. But I think that we should understand the risks and the rewards so that every individual can be fully informed and make up their own minds. And I wish that we would get back to that kind of journalism.
Most certainly. Earlier this morning when I woke up, I watched the news as I often do. And I think in Norway, about 10 individuals died because of the side effects of the vaccines. And I know also there's a growing movement on social media and everywhere else where people are promoting ivermectin as an antidote of COVID-19, or rather as something that I saw that facial expression. But I think the point I'm trying to get at here is at least give people options. Don't always push one side of the narrative that benefits you as either the pharmaceutical industry or someone profiting from such productions. Do you feel that there'll come a time where two sides of the story are given to the public and we as the public are allowed the opportunity to choose which side we favor the most?
Well, certainly that's the way it's supposed to work, right? I mean, we're supposed to present factual information. Now, you don't present a side that is not based on facts and is not based, not accurate. But yes, risks and rewards and balance and informed decision making, is at the heart of individual autonomy and freedom. And if you have leadership or companies or media that is taking that away, that's a real problem, and that's what I think we see in big media companies. But yes, to your point, we need to understand, everybody, what are the risks in particular from these vaccines? What are the rewards? Weigh that in your own mind. If you're somebody who has, a propensity for very, anaphylactic and allergenic, responses to things, or you're particularly frail, or maybe it's not a good idea to take a vaccine. But you should have that information and make those risk analysis and those choices for yourself. Certainly not have a media outlet or a government leader decide that for you.
Carey, I think if we're to sit down and talk about these issues, I'll be more depressed than encouraged, because I'm looking all over the world and I'm thinking there's more doom and gloom than there is some positive light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not sure whether I'm walking in the right tunnel or not, but I sense that there's a lot that we as humanity still need to dig deep into and find out. And we need people like you, investigative journalists. Not that you need to always put your life at risk on our behalf as humanity, but I think your work is critical in the sense that without us being conscious enough to say, she's right, and you as a corporate business have been wrong all along, almost all of your hard work falls onto deaf ears.
Well, that's depressing, isn't it? I don't think that. I do see, light and optimism and things, because I do think you're seeing an increasing awareness. I think little voices like mine and many others around the world, we are getting out there a little bit, and people who care, and people like you, having this forum right now where we can talk about this. You are helping educate and inform, and that's what's required for change. So we can't give up. We just have to keep trying to do our best, and that's all we can do. I think just keep moving forward and trying to be honest and truthful and put information out there and hope that it matters.
Thank you so much, Carey, for your time, for sharing your insight as well as your extensive research, and also putting your life as well as that of your family at risk and inconveniencing yourself for us to get to the bottom line as well as understand the truth for what it is. I'm going to play you out with a song by Beyonce called My Power, because nobody can take it away from you. And after that, I'm going to play you Michael Jackson, and lastly, Eddie Grant, Give Me Hope, Joanna, because you've given us hope.
I love that. Thank you. That's great. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Do take care and all of the best with your future endeavors.
All right. Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.